talking about is the fanzine that he and I published in the early nineties called Flat, which in my humble opinion is the best fanzine we ever did.
I mean, so he's got a mind of his own. Did you want to make an announcement, Tommy, or you will not? All right then, well, let's get on the way. You know, I'm Sandra Bond, as you know, and the stage up here may look a little emptier than it was in the last panel with the two of us. But bear in mind that here alongside me, we have not only Ted White, we also have, you know, Jacob Edwards, we have Rod Archer, we have Dr. Progresso, we have Noel Elkhart, we, Ted, as everyone in this audience must be aware, has been a fan for nearly 75 years and has done pretty much everything there is to do in Pastor. And it's a great pleasure to have him here at the talk. Now, I believe, John, I'm going to and Ted, I think everyone has something you want to ask the audience, yes?
Yes, I have a request, but I'll preface it with a little anecdote. Back in 1961, I had a Vimeo shop in Greenwich Village, which was known in fandom as Tower Hall. And we didn't do a lot of commercial mimeography, but we did a lot of fanzines. And a tradition arose. Terry Carr and Pete Graham and I were the sort of the senior fans who were involved in Tower Hall. And a lot of the younger fans, neo fans of the day, would hang out there with us. And it became common for us to request one of them to go across the street to a little deli where they had one of these old-fashioned coolers where bottles of soda sat in the cooler in a slot. And you had to slide them down the slot to a place where you could remove them after you'd stuck, I don't know, 10 cents per quarter or something in. You could pop one out. And so we would send somebody across the street with the money we didn't expect them to pay to get us sodas. And the catchphrase became, "How would you like to make a BMF happy?" And I would like to ask if someone could fetch me a Diet Pepsi, you would make me very happy. Thank you.
So, whilst, refreshments are fetched, Ted, obviously on the programme at countless conventions, probably not just on panels, but you've been interviewed before. What would you say has been, your favourite ever appearance at a convention?
Oh gosh, that's a good question, but I'm not sure I have an answer to it. There have been so many. My first convention was also my first Worldcon. That was 1955, Cleveland. Back in the days when Worldcons were much like Corfus in the sense that they were a gathering of a community. Many old friends, and then new ones. Of course, my first convention, I didn't know anybody except the people I went with. But I knew names, and I spent much of that convention putting faces to names and meeting people and becoming friends with them. So in some respects, I suppose my first Worldcon was amongst the most impressive to me, but there have been so many highlights over the years. Of course, I co-chaired in '67, and it was Lynn Bushhager, which reminded me I was all over that. I'm an egotist, as many fans are, and I enjoy, taking part in a lot of different activities. I was also, I guess you'd call them omni fan that I was a collector and was a congoer and was a fanzine producer, ultimately a con chair. So I've covered all the bases.
I mean, I'm guessing obviously you probably weren't on the program at that first time.
Oh, no.
You know, how long did it take you before they started asking you to appear?
I'm not sure. I was nobody special in fan in the 50s. I mean, I was graduating from being a Dio fan and I was learning how to write. I mean, I became a fan when I was 13, so I did a lot of growing up. I've had to say that, you know, it wasn't like I was somebody anyone would ask to be on a program any more than any other Dio fan that year. But by the 60s, I guess, I was starting to be on panels. Well, actually, 1959, Tension, there was this big panel. I was a member of it, but there were like 6 or 7 of us on it. So I didn't dominate any means. But the topic of the panel was essentially, I don't know the name, but the essential topic was the death of science fiction.
It's not genre.
Because at that time, science fiction magazines were dying like flies. And we had up to 50 different titles in the middle 50s. By the end of the 50s, we had maybe a half dozen. And at the same time, of course, SF Books was burgeoning. Everything was shifting from one venue to another in terms of publishing. But everybody had an opinion about the death of science fiction, whatever. And what started out as a panel discussion was quickly taken over by the audience. And it lasted for hours. It went on. I mean, at some point, I and my fellow panelists left the panel and the discussion continued. I mean, I think this was not long before dinner. It was like a 3 or 4 p.m. panel to begin with, and it just segued into the end of the daytime program.
Will this panel have been the inspiration in any way for Earl Kemp's famous sympathy for science fiction?
I'm sure it had an effect on that, not least because Earl was one of those people in the audience who was keeping it going.
Well, as we know, science fiction didn't die. It, and
if only it had.
Well, no, it was a few. Within a few years, you were being discussed from a magazine of fantasy and science fiction, weren't you?
I was. You want to know how that came about?
Absolutely.
Well, it's very simple. Auburn Davidson was a friend of mine. I don't know exactly when we met, but by the time I moved to New York City in 1959, we knew each other. And I remember on one occasion, I ran into him in Washington Square Park. And I was blurting to him about how I just made my first professional sale, which was to Playboy. And that sounds impressive, but it wasn't. Playboy had this column called something like Playboy After Dark or something, just a collection of short anecdotes about things. And I had submitted one, and it had been purchased, and I cashed the check. In fact, I had opened my first checking account with it, but it was never published. I heard that the editor, Ray Russell, liked it, but Hugh Hefner did not. So that was the end of my Playboy sale. But I ran into Avram in the park and I said, "Hey, Avram, I just made my first professional sale. Wow." And Avram beamed and congratulated me and acted like a real friend would. And so that was the real beginning of our friendship. Now, I earlier mentioned Towner Hall. Avram used to hang out at Towner Hall. And one day, well, I'm digressing here, but we'll go with it. One day he walked into Town Hall and Terry Carr was there and Auburn said, "Guess what, guys? I'm the new editor of FNSF. And we all congratulated him. And Terry immediately pulled out 3 very short stories. I mean, they were like 1 to 3,000. And he handed them to Avram, and Avram read them on the spot and said, I'll buy them. That was Terry's first SF sales.
Do you think one of them was Stanley Toothbrush?
I believe so. That may have appeared under the name of Carl Brandon because he had 2 stories per issue, so one was understood. At any rate, at that time, Avram lived in Manhattan, but then he got married to Grania, and he moved to Milford, Pennsylvania, which at that time was sort of the mecca for SF writers. David Knight lived there, James Blish lived there, Virginia Kidd lived there. It was a little scene that evolved into the Milford SF Writers Conference, which was the beginning of SF Writers Conferences. And so when Avram moved up there, he threw a party at some point, and I drove up to that party with my friend Les Gerber. And at the party, Les says to Avram, hey Avram, I've got a question for you. What's that? How quickly do you reject manuscripts? Because I sent you a story on Monday, and I got it back in the mail on Wednesday. And Avram said, yeah, well, we have this slush pile reader who was not actually reading the manuscripts. He was just taking and putting rejection slips in them and returning them instantly. And we had to let him go. And I said, have you refilled the job? And he said, no, not yet. And I said, gee, do you think I would be good for that? And he said, I don't know, why not? And I said, can I get a job? And he said, sure. And that's how I became an assistant editor of NetSet. And my basic job was reading the slush pile. Although over time I evolved, became more of a general. I did copy editing, I did blurb writing, I wrote a few book reviews. I even wrote 1 guest editorial for NetSet. And I owe all of that to Avram. Avram launched my professional editorial career. And I want to tell you a statistic about that. At some point, I would suppose more than a year in, I decided to do a statistical analysis of what I was doing. The first statistic was that I was reading approximately 600 manuscripts a month. Now, reading, I should put in quotes, because not all of them needed to be read. I mean, there was some that you'd read the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, and you knew the story was no good. And that was the easy rejection. The hard rejections were the stories that were just good enough that you had to read them all the way through to realize they wouldn't use them. But nonetheless, there would be some that were good. And it was my habit, I guess you could say, to forward on to Avram or his successor, Furman, around, maybe 6 stories a month for them to consider, to possibly use. And it turned out that about 1 a month was actually purchased and used. And for most of my time at FNSF, there was 1 slush pile story in every issue of FNSF, which I think is a pretty good record. And a few years ago, I was asked to do a reminiscence or article or something for an anniversary issue of FNSF, and Gordon Van Gelder asked me to do it, and I wrote up my experience with slush piles and the statistics that I just mentioned. And Gordon told me that those statistics had not changed appreciably over the years, which is pretty remarkable. I think actually 1 a month is a very high success ratio for slush pile stories.
I mean, I would probably say the same if I still want to have no experience of things. Yeah. So, after, moving forward from there, went on, started to, you sold the first story, you sold the first novels, and you shared your first book on, all, coming one after another in the mid to late sixties.
Yes, that's a good question.
No, I was hoping you might touch paper, might come out with something.
Thank you, sir. You have made me that happy.
Okay, well, let's take the World Con. Obviously, in 1967, the World Con was a very different proposition to what they were even 10 years subsequently, never mind how they are today. What particular issue problems did you face in 1967?
Oh, there were some interesting ones. Well, to begin with, the whole reason that we bid for the WorldCon, we being the fan class. Now, the fan class was one of several fan groups in New York City at that time. Because New York City had a long history of many fan groups often at war with each other. And fragmenting and fractioning, and reforming and whatnot. I mean, this goes back to the 30s. But the fan class took a different point of view than any previous club. To begin with, we were invitation only, but it wasn't that hard to get in if you were fanish. If you weren't fanish, we weren't interested in you, but we were pretty liberal in our definitions. I mean, Andy Porter was a member. But at any rate, we had gone to a Philcon, probably 64. And I, at that time, owned a Chevy Greenbrier van, which could seat up to 9 people, but usually more like 6 or so. But we would go in that van to various regional cons, displays, cons, what have you, as a group, as a club. And coming back from that Philcon, and there were 5 or 6 of us in the car, we started talking about the convention as fans both. And we discussed the fact that Jack Chalker, of all people, and we did not like Jack. He was not yet a professional, he was just an obnoxious Baltimore fan. He was going to bid for the 67 Worldcon, which was, in rotation to do, was East Coast in 67. And we all were bemused by this, and we said, my God, if Jack Chalker can bid for a Worldcon, anyone can bid for a Worldcon. What the hell? We could bid for a Worldcon. And that's where our bid started. Then we got serious about it. We decided we'd really, go all out for it. And we did a number of things to promote it. We put out publications like Jack Gaughan, who was a member of the fan class and a well-known professional artist at that time, but previously a fan. He did something called Nikon Comics for us, several issues of which we passed out in promotion. And we did all kinds of other promotional gimmicks, like we had little bags that you could carry your fanzines around and printed up with New York in 67 on them, and handed them out at the 66 World Cup, the bidding would take place. We asked Harlan Ellison to be one of the seconders of our bid, which he did a very good job of. We were at that point up against not only Baltimore, but Boston and Syracuse, Syracuse being Dave Kyle. And we won the bid. And one of the things that had been in my mind, now I was not per se the leader of the convention. The fan class didn't have any officers. And I was the host of the fan class at that time. They met in my apartment. But I would not say that I ran the fan class, because we were more anarchistic than that. But as Nikon went, I was co-chair with my good friend and collaborator on a couple of books, Dave Anneman. And we made a very effective pair. Our talents complemented each other well. And I did have most of the ideas that motivated the convention. There were a number of things that bothered me about the way Worldcons had been run that I wanted to deal with. And I thought, this is my chance to try my ideas out. My principal idea had to do with the programming. It was my observation, and this is true today as it ever was, that most panels have 5 or 6 people on, but 1 or 2 at the most dominate that panel, do most of the talking. And maybe that's a good thing, and maybe it's not, depending on who they are. But it seemed like it was kind of a waste of the people who just sat up there on that stage but didn't say much. And I thought, let's boil it down. Let's make it more essential. Let's have 2-person panels, not kind of like what we're doing now, but not unlike it necessarily either. I called them dialogues. And the object was to have 2 people with perhaps contrasting points of view on some subject, or 2 people who had something in common. Like one of our dialogues was between Roger Zelazny and Samuel Delany, who were then the 2 hottest new science fiction writers in the field. We had others where people were more diametrically opposed in their viewpoints. But the idea was that with just 2 people on that stage, you got more going on. You cut to the essence of what it was the panel was about. And I always felt that this was a very successful programming idea, and it always bothered me that no one else really picked up and ran with it. Successive Worldcons. Although when I would voice this complaint, some people would say, well, yeah, we did that once. Or they had one dialogue panel. That was one of my big ideas, which wasn't too controversial at the time, although Mike Resnick later panned it in a very stupid con report he wrote many years after the fact from Mimosa. Another of my ideas was that the Hugos mostly honored pros and not fans. There was one fan Hugo, it was the fanzine Hugo. It was not a very prestigious Hugo, not only because it was fandom versus prodom, but because the early winners of the fanzine Hugo had been publications like Jimmy Curace's Fantasy Times or SF Times, so. Which was a news zine, but not well written, just very utilitarian. And at that time, there were far, far better fanzines being published, but they didn't have the circulation, so they didn't get the Hugo. I wanted there to be more fan Hugos. I wanted the fan Hugos to be parallel to the pro Hugos. I thought this is only fair. I mean, what is the Worldcon? It's not a pros convention. It was a fans convention. And yet, it was even then evolving into being mostly in honor of pros. And I thought there was much to be celebrated and honored about fans. So I did 2 things. I expanded with 2 more categories, best fan artist and best fan writer. And I changed the name, which didn't catch. I'll get to that. Our guest of honor that year, our fan guest of honor, was Bob Tucker. Bob Tucker, as far as I'm concerned, invented fan sheets. Now, not entirely by himself. I mean, the early years in the 30s, there was the great Staple Wars. It was him and Don Wollheim having this mock battle with letter columns of the prozine, so that whether prozine should have staples or not. You know, it was a very facetious and very fanish and fairly humorously fought mock feud. And at that time, also in the 30s, and also mostly in the prozine letter columns, even the standards, Tucker had letters published under the pseudonym, transparent pseudonym, Hoy Ping Pong. And so I decided that we should name the award, the fan Hugos, the Palms, for Bob Tucker, in honor of Bob Tucker. I was then unaware of the British meaning of the word palm. This rubbed some Hugo fanzine nominees the wrong way. Principally, a guy named Bill Millardy, who with Bill Bowers was putting out a fanzine called Double Bill, which was nominated that year. And as far as he and his compatriots thought, a palm was not a worthy honor for their fanzine. Only a Hugo would do. They wanted the same award Robert Heinlein got. They totally missed the whole point of fan Hugos. And they made quite a ruckus. And at the business meeting on Sunday morning, which I actually attended despite the hour, the additional categories were adopted, but the name was rejected. And I wanted to call them Fan Achievement Awards as opposed to SF Achievement Awards for Hugos. They all ended up being Hugos, and they've stayed Hugos ever since. And over the years, I have come to regret having introduced these additional two categories. I now think that was a mistake. Because what it did, as Bill Millardy amply illustrated, is they promoted something I call Hugo Lust, which to me, that's no reason to publish a fanzine. You don't publish a fanzine to win awards. You publish a fanzine because you want to publish a fanzine. And because you want to make it as good as you like, and you want your friends to like it, and you'd like other people to like it. But you don't want to do it just so that you can go up on the stage and be handed a little statue, rocket ship or something else. Publishing a fanzine for an award is to me a very bad motivation. And to the extent that the fan Hugos have been dominated by the Hugo Lust, I sincerely regret that I initiated. And of course, over the years, they've gone to a lot of people I don't even recognize as fans now. I mean, there was a guy named John Scalzi who used his fan writer Hugo in order to promote his professional career. Now, I won fan writer Hugo in 1968, I think, yeah, 68. And people would say to me, well, you should put Hugo winner in your books, on the covers. And I said, no, it's not an award for SF in my case. It's an award for my fan writing. And I don't believe that should be used to promote my professional writing. They're not the same thing. They're not done for the same reasons. And whatever quality my professional writing has, and I'd like to think it has some, it has nothing to do with fan writing, except that as a fan writer, I learned how to write. And ultimately, and with the help of my friend Terry Carr, I learned how to write professionally.
Well, going off the back of that and your mention of Dave Van Arnhem, your co-chair, I know you also wrote fiction professionally with him. In fact, throughout your fan career, you were involved in one hell of a lot of collaborations. Right back from the early days of the 50s when you were co-editing with Larry Stark, you co-edited with the rest of the Boyd boys. Dan Stephan down here, was your co-editor on hot and on Matt, we co-edited across the Atlantic with Rob House.
That's true.
Yeah, and your first fiction sales, the collaboration with Marius and Bradley. Tell me, Ted, why, do you think there's any particular reason why you were such a promiscuous collaborator, or do you think you just enjoy it, or?
Well, I think there were different reasons for each of them. My actual first co-editor was Bob Stewart, fellow spelled his name Phod. Bob Stewart was one of my earliest friends at fandom and remained my friend for the rest of his life. And very early on in my Neo days, my first fanzine, which was called Zip and was Crud Bob contacted me and said that he had been doing this fanzine that he was actually producing on a hectograph. And he didn't want to continue with it, but he had material for another issue. And he sent the material to me, and that, by my mind, made him my co-editor. So he was my co-editor on the SID for several issues. With Larry Stark, I decided to do a fanzine devoted to fan fiction. That's fiction about fans, not fiction about TV shows. And Larry Stark, in the mid-50s, who was also a friend of mine, a good friend. I mean, he spent his summers with me in New Jersey, but he'd come out and spend his summers with me while I was still living with my folks. And he was, in those days, probably the best writer of fan fiction around. There weren't many. I mean, there wasn't a large competition or anything, but he wrote real stories that revolved around fanish situations, fanish types, and the kind of problems they would have. And this impressed the hell out of me. I mean, Larry was a few years older than me. He was, in fact, an early mentor. And it just was natural when I wanted to do a fan fiction fanzine. I was going to have something by Larry in every issue anyway, so why not make him a co-editor, which I did. But that only lasted for 2 or 3 issues, actually 2.5. The start with Stellar number 8, continuation number 6. And by Stellar number 10, which was our lead off on adoration issue, Larry had proposed the idea, but circumstances forced him to drop out of the co-editorship before the issue was done. So I finished. Then on, I was the editor. With Void, it was the other way around. Greg Benford and his twin brother Jim, had been doing Void for 13 issues. They started it in the mid-50s. They were living in Germany as army brats. And it was a pretty decent fanzine. It wasn't all that well produced, but it had good material. And when they graduated high school and came back to the U.S. and were ready to start college, I gotta remember fans in those days, primarily teenage, high school and college kids. Jim wanted to drop out. Jim basically gap yeared. And Greg looked around, and at that time, our mutual friend, and he was close to both of us, Ken Rumoff, had just died. And Greg wrote to me about that, and then asked if I would like to take over Void. And I said, well, I don't exactly want to take it over. I was doing my own fanzine at the time called Gambit. And I said, I'll co-edit it with you, as long as you continue to, have a presence in the fanzine. And so that's how I became a co-editor and the publisher of Void. And initially, Greg, he was very caught up in his first year in college, and so he wasn't doing a whole lot. I got him to do a regular editorial column, and I would send him the letters of comment for him to write responses to, so that he was part of the letter column. But otherwise, all the scout work, the typing, the stenciling, the mimeography, the collating, the mailing out, all that I did. And it got to be a bit of a much for me. And at that time, Pete Graham, who had been a West Coast pen, Bay Area pen, from good friend of Terry Carr's, had moved to New York City. And we had established contact. And so I got Pete involved with the boy. And he became the third co-editor. Then in '61, Terry Carr's marriage to his first wife ended. And he was at loose ends and in a dead-end job working in a library. And I wrote to him and I said, Terry, you have to come to New York. You have many good reasons to come to New York. You want to go away from where you're forced to be socializing with your ex-boyfriend, your new boyfriend. And New York is as far away as you can get. And plus, you can do something for your professional career. You can start a professional career. I know you can do it. You can write. And so he took me up on it. He moved to New York City. And as soon as he moved to New York City, he became the fourth co-editor of Voice. And he merged his fancy Innuendo. Very successful. And that was a very good collaborative editor because although Pete was something of a co-editor, he also did a column, he did stuff on the scene. Terry really, Terry and I had this thing going. Now, Terry was a year older than me, and had come into fandom a year before me, so, or rather, at an age 1 year younger than me. So he came into fandom at 12, but it was 2 years before I got it. I looked up to him. I knew that he wrote better than I did. He was a very good editor. And our skills were fairly complementary, but I learned enormously. And we reached the point where, we would write our editorials and stuff out in manuscript form on typewriter, but then we stencil it. But I might stencil Terry's editorial and Terry might stencil mine. And as we would stencil, we would often rewrite. And so Terry wrote a lot of what appeared under my name. I wrote some of what appeared under Terry's name. Both of us wrote some of what appeared under Pete's name, most in the letter column responses. And generally, we had a lot of fun just messing around and doing all that stuff. So that was Void. And Void was an excellent fanzine. I'm still proud of it. It's all up on Fanac. And thank God all the scans are really good. The mimeography was impeccable. So it's very readable, unlike some of the derivative fanzines.
I guess as well that, it probably didn't hurt to have multiple editors to split the cost between.
Oh, if only. Well, see, the costs were nowhere near as significant as they are now. I mean, postage, mailed those fanzines out for 2 or 3 cents a copy. You had a 2-ounce limit for the basic postage. And so we do a 24-page fanzine, which 20-pound paper is 2 ounces. Then, in order to increase the pages, I went to 16-pound canary second sheets, which were real cheap, 90 cents a ream. And took a little extra work. You had to slip sheet them because they would cling to each other, static cling coming out of the movie, cause a mess. But the stencils and the ink, I got all of those for wholesale. I had a mimic shop. I was a professional. Well, moving on co-editor wise, in the early middle 60s, but I guess 63 actually, I had moved to Brooklyn. Void had ended because Terry's professional career had taken off, so had mine. But I had a friend named Les Gerber who lived in Brooklyn. I'd actually met Les Grover at the 56th night con when he was 11 years old. I mean, meet is probably the wrong word. I was aware of it. He was one of two 11-year-old fans running around that convention wearing little suits and carrying briefcases, wearing hats, and pretending they were members of the Goon Detective Agency, which was John Barry, the Irish fan's thing, the Goon Detective Agency. And they had picked up on that. But by the time I moved to New York City 3 years later, they had grown up a good bit. And both there was Les and his friend Andy Reese. And Andy became a cartoonist for Lloyd and a good friend. He subsequently went on to be a major artist. And I have some of his real art. He did a portrait of me, which is quite good. And so anyway, Les and I decided to do a fanzine together, which we called Minac, which subsequently Richard Bergeron coined the term in small fanzine to describe Minac. And in small to me meant the opposite of enlarged, obviously. But the concept was that in a rather small fanzine, like a dozen pages, say, we sort of had a complete little fanzine, editorials, columns, and letters, all of that. But it was all relatively short. Terry Carter reviewed fanzines. And Minac lasted into '64 when it was essentially killed by the whole boondoggle nonsense, '64 Exclusion Act, and all that. We took one side, contributed to another. So that was the end of Minac. Plus, my live-in girlfriend of a year and a half ended up moving in with Les, and that somewhat fractured our relationship. It didn't destroy our friendship. We're still friends to this day. Then in the, I guess it was '66 or '67, another young new fan joined the fan class, and that was the American John Barry. And he fit in instantly. We were immediately pleased to have him amongst us. And after a couple of years, I think it was in '68, I could be off for a year, John and I started co-editing a fanzine called Peekaboo. I liked having titles that were really cut to the core of fan. Minac, Peekaboo, all of that. And we did Peekaboo in two incarnations, you might say. First incarnation was while I was living in Brooklyn, which was through September of 1970. And in that incarnation, you could say I was the publisher, but John and I were the co-editors. Then after I moved to Virginia, there was a little hiatus, and then John picked up the ball and essentially became the publisher. And while Peekaboo had been somewhat Minac-like in that it was a smallish print, the second incarnation was much more of a fanzine, 20 pages and up kind of fanzine. And I give John a lot of credit for that. That was an excellent incarnation of Peekaboo. I believe it, and John can contradict me if I'm wrong, I believe it was modeled on the late '50s Oops Law, a Greg Calkins fanzine, which to my mind was one of the great unsung fanzines. It had a very simple formula. Editorial, 2 columns, 1 article, letter column. And the 2 columns were by major pianists, Bombshell, or somebody like that. And when John started publishing Peekaboo, one of the things he did was to essentially revive something that had been a back cover feature in Haifa, Walt Willis's eavesdroppings, which were interesting little quotes pulled somewhere out.
Which of course we to the current moment, if you go onto the call through Discord, you'll find it, one of the channels is called Overheard of the Con. And those are basically exactly eavesdroppings for the current day.
So that was Eagle Blue, which I remain proud of. And then I got seriously involved in being a professional editor, doing amazing, fantastic things. And that kind of curtailed a lot of my fan. I never stopped being a fan. I followed the Bob Tucker model. You could be a fan and a pro. You don't have to choose. But in, what was it, 1981, Dan? Yeah.
We were going to start Bob Brad. They had zero.
Well, at any rate, Dan and I started up Palm. And at that time, fanzines tended to fall into a single category. Large, bloated fanzines that came out once or twice a year. And this just seemed wrong to me, because I remember in my Neo days, lots of short, brief fanzines that came out frequently. Like in the late 50s, my friend John Magnus did a thing called Rumble, which came out every week. It was like 1 or 2 sheets mailed in an ordinary business envelope for 3 cents first class. And he had a select mailing list that he had boiled down to, I don't know, it was either 35 or 50 people that he regarded as the most significant people in the family. And they were in the mailing list. I mean, he did a big fat ginseng called Variosa, which was much like but Rumble was a little frequent thing. And so I was accustomed to there being little frequent fanzines as well as big fat ginsengs. But there hadn't been any little frequent fanzines by 1980, 10 years or more.
There was Fast Boots and that.
Right, Alan Boston. Right, that was while I was at Heavy Metal, which was in 1980. Alan Bostic was doing a little fanzine called Fast and Loose, which I strongly encourage and did a column for. I thought this was a very good thing for fandom, because the frequent fanzine had, well, think of the fanzine Tag, which won a Hugo in 1958, something like that. That came out initially once a week. And after the first half year or so, it came out every other week. And it was billed as a Spanish news scene, but it was as much gossip as it was news, and it was all fascinating. It kept you up to date on everything going on in fandom, and it did so because it was written by Terry Carr and Mark Neely in a very witty Spanish way. And I felt the absence of that in fandom by 1981. And so I proposed to Dan that we do Palm. And which again, I was drawing on the Boy Pink poem Bob Tucker reference. I was subsequently enlightened by our British readers on the British meaning of the word poem, which nonetheless I accepted as what the hell. In the family tradition of self-mockery, there's nothing wrong with calling your fanzine a bad.
You've got a letter from Bob Shaw saying, this morning I noticed a slight fog in my hall, so I decided to write you about it. We're running a bit low on time, I'm afraid, Ted. But yeah, I mean, we barely touched on,
We could go on for another hour each.
yeah, we barely touched on your career and amazing and fantastic that you've had. But there's one question I did want to ask you to finish off with, if I may. You've done pretty much everything there is to do in fandom over your long career. Is there anything that you've never actually done in fandom which always wished you had?
No.
Okay, well, in that case,
Do we want to take a few questions?
I was going to say, in that case, if you can answer that with that, Rabbit, you might give us a couple of minutes if anyone in the audience has any questions that they'd be burning to ask, John.
Not much, not so much, not so much a question, but I would love to hear you kind of talk about your reviewing fantasy.
Talk about what?
Reviewing fantasy.
Reviewing?
Fantasy review. If you're part of fantasy that is hardly done anymore.
Yeah, I have strong opinions on that subject, as you may be well aware. I've always believed that fanzine should be held to certain standards, not necessarily the standards of the mundane world, but our standards, Spanish standards. But they include, trying to do good writing to the best of one's ability, good presentation, legibility is of essence. And of course, that these days in electronic fanzines, that's not an issue. The writing probably will always be. And I did a column of fanzine reviews for Habakkuk, Bill Donahue's fanzine, which caused significant controversy, at least with Guy Lillian III, whose Challenger, first issue of Challenger, I panned. And I don't regret penning it at all. It was a pretentious fanzine with a fan of the issue feature and a lot of other misogynistic nonsense. And I have never been, well, my first exposure to Guy Lillian was when I saw his letters in Julius Schwartz's comic books in the early 60s, Green Lantern, Flash, all that. And every Guy Lillian letter published, and there was one or nearly every issue, said, "Wow, this issue is the greatest ever." It was just gushing ass kissing, and of the most obsequious and obnoxious sort. And I found this was reflected in his fanzine Challenger. He did not take kindly to this review. And he was at that time some kind of a prosecutor in New Orleans. And I was then having my little problems with being arrested for being a dope seller and going to jail. And he essentially said that if he had been my prosecutor, he'd have gone to the death sentence. He had something nasty to say about me in the next 2 or 3 issues, Challenger, none of which he sent. I had to see other people's copies, I think Rich Brown's or somebody's, to find this out. And I wrote him a letter about it, which he scrawled a nasty comment across the bottom of and mailed back to me. And did not publish it. I regarded him as a jerk and having bad fan ethics, but that's neither here nor there. But that controversy kind of defined my column for Habakkuk, even though that was one of the very few negative reviews in the issues. I mean, I probably did maybe 3 or 4 of those columns, and most of the reviews were very positive. In fact, I've reviewed 2 or 3 fanzines in a column, and giving each one a fair amount of space. And in the same column of the Challenger review, there were 2 positive reviews. So, it annoyed me that was how I was defined. I was defined as a kill the fuckers fanzine review. After that, maybe 5 or 10 years later, I did a column of fanzine reviews that were the direct opposite. I wrote them for a syndicate of club fanzine. The Whisper Journal, there was whatever the Lost was one was that Marty Cantor was doing. And there was a Texas one, and there was a Canadian one. I'm not sure how many there were. There might have been as many as 6 people using it. And the whole concept behind it was to introduce club fans to fanzines. open it up a little bit, get these people interested in what I regard as the core of family. And, I have to say that your results were very disappointing. In the sense that I would query the editors of the fanzines I reviewed after the fact and say, you know, did you get any response? And most of them said no.
If you look in the anthology for this call, through which contains text guest of honor speech from the Vegas call through where he was guest, I think, when the late, when he
Yeah, tell us about that.
yeah, the late Dwayne Casey, I think, said that he got requests from Texas as a result of your column, and nobody else looked into having any support.
And until I read that speech, I had forgotten that there had been any difference. But that was me as a fanzine reviewer.
You and your trenchant bludgeon here. All right, well, I think the time, I'm afraid, has come that we're gonna have to wrap this up. I'd like to thank you very much, Tim Wright, and invite you to show your appreciation for our